Many intuitive introverts feel like no one understands them, and this feeling starts early. From childhood, they notice that their reflections and perceptions go beyond what others typically notice. When they try to express themselves, they often receive confused looks or superficial responses, which leads them to believe that their ideas are too complicated to share. Over time, this difference becomes even more evident. INFJs, INTJs, INFPs, and INTPs process the world in a more abstract and profound way, while society values objectivity and quick communication. This can lead to frustration, isolation, and the feeling that they will never truly be understood. But this dilemma doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. It simply means their way of perceiving reality doesn't follow the common standard. To find out your psychological type, you can take a test based on Jung's studies, which is easily found online. The issue isn't about being better or worse than others, but rather understanding how to deal with this difference. Instead of closing themselves off, there are ways to turn this characteristic into a strength. But first, it's important to understand what makes these personality types so prone to feeling out of place. The intuitive introverts, according to Carl Jung. Jung revolutionized the way we understand the human mind by dividing individuals into different psychological types. Within this framework, he defined introversion as an orientation toward the inner world, while intuition refers to the ability to grasp hidden patterns and meanings without the need for concrete evidence. When these two traits combine, we have what are called intuitive introverts, people who live in a dense mental universe, full of symbols, deep insights, and reflections that often can't be translated into simple words. For them, reality isn't limited to what can be seen or proven, but also includes what can be read between the lines. Among intuitive introverts, we find four main types within Jung's typology. INFJ introverted, intuitive, feeling, judging; INTJ introverted, intuitive, thinking, judging; INFP introverted, intuitive, feeling, perceiving; and INTP introverted, intuitive, thinking, perceiving. All share a strong tendency toward intuition, being naturally inclined to think in an abstract and pattern-oriented way. This means an INFJ can pick up on unspoken emotions with impressive accuracy, an INTJ can see strategies and outcomes long before anyone else, an INFP feels the deep meaning of things intensely, and an INTP gets lost in intellectual possibilities and complex theories. The problem? Few people around them can keep up with this mental process. Imagine an INFJ sensing that a friend is lying but having no concrete proof. They try to warn them, only to receive a skeptical look and a "you're overreacting." Or an INTJ who notices patterns in the economy and warns about a future risk, only to be ignored until the problem actually happens. Or an INFP who feels something is wrong in a relationship but is labeled too sensitive. When time proves them right, they don't feel satisfaction, they feel loneliness. Over time, many choose to stay silent, realizing their perceptions are hard to convey to others. But how far can this go? The persona and the social mask. Jung described the persona as the social mask we wear to fit into the world. It's the filter we choose when interacting with different people, adjusting our expressions, emotions, and behaviors to be accepted. For an intuitive introvert, however, this adaptation can become a real dilemma. To what extent is it worth molding oneself to be accepted? And to what extent does this compromise their own identity? These types already have a deeper and more complex view of reality, and forcing them to simplify who they are can create a suffocating sense of disconnection. Each type faces this conflict differently. An INFJ may feel the need to appear more sociable than they really are, trying to please others and avoiding showing their mental exhaustion. An INTJ may mask their emotions to avoid seeming vulnerable, becoming almost inaccessible. An INFP, sensitive by nature, may hide their emotional intensity to avoid being seen as weak or dramatic by others. The INTP, on the other hand, may force themselves to maintain casual conversations that, to them, seem uninteresting, just to avoid being labeled as cold or distant. All feel they need to mold themselves to fit into spaces that don't always understand them. Now, imagine a crowded party. The INFJ forces a smile and tries to seem cheerful, but every interaction drains them. The INTJ listens to a shallow conversation about celebrities and feels an internal urge to leave. The INFP watches someone being insensitive and swallows their frustration, knowing they'll be called overdramatic if they react. The INTP, bored by superficial chatter, pretends to be interested to avoid awkwardness. In the end, everyone leaves feeling deeply drained, as if they've spent too much time playing a role that doesn't represent them. Exhaustion and isolation. Being an intuitive introvert often means living in a mental world that few can access. Over time, this difference becomes evident and can create an uncomfortable feeling of being out of place. When someone tries to explain their perceptions and is met with confused looks or empty responses, a hard-to-ignore frustration is born. The constant effort to adapt can drain mental and emotional energy. The burden of explaining the obvious to others becomes heavy, and in many cases, the best choice seems to be silence. This exhaustion manifests in various ways. Some begin to avoid social interactions because they know they'll have to translate their thoughts into a more accessible language. Others maintain superficial conversations but feel like they're just playing a role. And there are those who try, time and time again, to express themselves as clearly as possible, only to be labeled as complicated, intense, or even weird. This creates a dilemma. Should they keep trying to communicate and deal with the exhaustion, or accept isolation to preserve their mental energy? The challenge of communication. For an intuitive introvert, communication is a constant challenge. Their mind operates on multiple layers, processing information in complex ways and connecting ideas that aren't always easy to translate to others. The dilemma arises when they need to decide between speaking their true thoughts or limiting their words to avoid confusion. If they're too concise, they feel their message loses depth. If they elaborate on every thought, they come across as long-winded or hard to follow. This creates internal frustration, as they often realize the essence of what they want to express doesn't reach the other person as they imagined. Some intuitive introverts, recognizing this barrier, choose to speak little or almost nothing. If the experience of being misunderstood repeats itself, they begin to internalize the idea that their words aren't worth the effort. Others, in an attempt to be understood, dive into long, detailed explanations but are interrupted or notice vague looks from those who've already given up trying to follow them. Over time, this cycle can lead to isolation or increasingly limited communication. However, there is a balance to be found. By learning to structure their speech better and adapt their language to the context, intuitive introverts can make their messages more accessible without losing depth. This doesn't mean molding themselves to please others but finding more strategic ways to share their thoughts. Small adjustments in communication can prevent feelings of isolation and create more authentic connections. But there's a risk that needs to be avoided when the difficulty of being understood turns into detachment and arrogance. The risk of emotional elitism. When someone spends their life feeling like their ideas are ignored or misunderstood, a dangerous defense mechanism can emerge: emotional and intellectual elitism. Many intuitive introverts, realizing that few can keep up with their depth of thought, develop the belief that most people are superficial or incapable of understanding the truth. This view might bring momentary relief, turning frustration into a sense of superiority. But in the long run, it only reinforces detachment and prevents the creation of genuine connections. This elitism often doesn't stem from arrogance but from the repeated feeling of inadequacy. When their perceptions are dismissed or seen as exaggeration, the natural tendency is to withdraw and create a bubble where only a few, chosen ones, are worthy of attention. The problem? This isolation reinforces the idea that no one is on their level, further distancing them from reality. What was once a defense against the pain of rejection becomes a barrier that blocks any form of genuine connection. It's important to be careful not to fall into this trap. Closing oneself off in their own world might feel comfortable, but it ultimately restricts new experiences and learning. True wisdom doesn't lie in judging others for their lack of depth, but in learning to communicate in a way that makes depth accessible. After all, what good is it to see patterns that no one else sees if it only leads to greater isolation? The secret lies in balancing this perception without using it as a shield against the world. But how can this balance be found? Strategies for dealing with the feeling of being misunderstood. Feeling misunderstood can be exhausting, but it doesn't have to be an inevitable fate. Instead of retreating into isolation, intuitive introverts can adopt strategies to turn this feeling into something constructive. The first step is self-awareness. Accepting that thinking differently isn't a flaw but rather a personality trait that can be used productively completely changes how one sees their place in the world. Instead of asking, "Why doesn't anyone understand me?" the question becomes, "How can I use this unique way of perceiving the world to my advantage?" Additionally, learning assertive communication can make all the difference. It's not always about changing what you say but how you say it. Finding more accessible ways to express deep thoughts without losing authenticity prevents the frustration of being misunderstood. This doesn't mean oversimplifying complex ideas, but rather organizing them in a way that others can follow. Adjusting communication to the context can make interactions feel more natural and less draining. Finally, seeking like-minded communities can be an effective way to reduce feelings of isolation. Instead of insisting on being understood by those who don't share the same way of thinking, finding spaces where your ideas are naturally well received can bring great relief. Whether through reading, discussion groups, or even one-on-one conversations, connecting with people who value the depth of intuitive introverted thinking can transform isolation into belonging. But for this transformation to happen, it's necessary to step out of your comfort zone and actively seek connections. How can this be done in a practical way? Resources for self-development. Understanding yourself is one of the most important steps for an intuitive introvert. To achieve this, seeking knowledge from reliable sources can help solidify this understanding. The book Psychological Types by Carl Jung is essential for anyone looking to delve deeper into the concept of personality types and how the mind operates. Meanwhile, Quiet. The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking by Susan Cain explains how introverts can find balance in a world that values extroversion. Beyond books, studying introverted intuition, and extroverted intuition, helps clarify how these cognitive processes work. Often, the feeling of being misunderstood stems from a lack of clarity about one's own way of thinking. The more you understand your mental processes, the easier it becomes to handle communication and social interaction challenges. And stay tuned to this channel, where I'll bring more videos like this one. This allows intuitive introverts to realize that their challenges aren't flaws but rather characteristics that can be adjusted to improve adaptation to the external world. Another important resource is keeping a record of thoughts and perceptions. Writing helps organize the mind, identify internal patterns, and recognize repetitive behaviors. Over time, this practice strengthens self-confidence and aids in managing emotions. But for many, the biggest obstacle to feeling understood isn't just how they think, but the influence that certain past experiences still have on their present reactions. identifying and dealing with emotional triggers. Intuitive introverts often carry memories of moments when they felt misunderstood, and these experiences can become emotional triggers. Sometimes, a simple comment can evoke the same frustration they felt in childhood or adolescence when they tried to express themselves and were ignored. This leads them to avoid certain interactions, even when the current situation doesn't justify this reaction. Without realizing it, they end up repeating patterns of isolation and reinforcing the belief that no one can understand them. Identifying these triggers is essential to avoid automatic reactions that limit social interaction. When the feeling arises that no one cares or that it's not worth trying to explain something, it's important to question whether this truly comes from the present moment or if it's a reflection of past memories. In many cases, the mind reacts based on old experiences, and understanding this can prevent misunderstandings. By recognizing these patterns, it becomes easier to control them rather than simply reacting on autopilot. To work through these emotions, practices like meditation and professional therapy can be very effective. Meditation helps develop awareness of one's own reactions, creating a space between the stimulus and the emotional response. Therapy, on the other hand, can provide support for reframing past experiences and breaking thought patterns that reinforce isolation. However, simply identifying triggers isn't enough. It's essential to turn this awareness into concrete actions to change daily reactions. Feeling misunderstood is frustrating, but it doesn't mean you're alone in this. Many people face similar challenges, dealing with the difficulty of expressing themselves, balancing authenticity and adaptation, and finding people who truly understand them. The world may seem geared toward superficiality, especially these days, but there are those who value depth and genuine connection. Sometimes, the secret isn't about trying to fit in anywhere but rather seeking the right spaces where your way of thinking is welcomed and appreciated. If you've experienced something like this, share your story in the comments. Your experience might help others realize they're not alone, and who knows, this could be the first step toward new connections. If you enjoyed this content, subscribe to the channel, and check out the list of books I recommend in the first pinned comment.